Hello and welcome to the next tour with
Ian?
and Andia. We are coming to you today, just the two of us.
Yeah, just
Kind of
two of
fun.
us.
This is episode 42. This is Transition Checklist.
Yeah. So what we wanted to do today was kind of like reflect back on like the last year and a half. Can you believe it's been that since we've
Crazy.
been doing this? And kind of give you all, what we found over that time and having all these different guests on kind of what the major bins of things that folks should be considering when they are separating out of military service, whether it's just, after a single enlistment or after a 30 plus year career and you're retiring or what have you. But all these kind of major categories have some kind of similarities and some overlap. We're going to be doing a lot of referencing back to previous episodes to make it easy for you all to go back and really get the deep dive into that expert in that topic,
Mhm.
and really kind of maybe refresh on some of those things as you're coming up on your transition, perhaps, or as you're advising folks who are coming up on theirs, because, this network is what it's all about.
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the things is that, we hear from everyone that this is all really overwhelming. And we've broken this down over a year and a half, but then how do we make this a little easier? So we're hoping that this helps. And this was Ian's idea, which I thought was brilliant. And so we're just going to break it down into these big buckets. So I guess I'll jump right in then.
Go for it.
So I'm going to talk first about health insurance. And this one is a big one. Whether you're retiring or you're moving to a different employer or both, there are things to think of. There is actually a great website. It's we'll link this in the show notes, but it's tricare.mil/life event/retiring. So this is especially for retirees, but there's a great checklist on there to think about things. So you can move to TRICARE, of course, when you're retiring, and you have to choose, right? TRICARE Select or TRICARE Prime. So there's a lot of things to choose there. And then you also may have your employer plan, or maybe you're using some of both. And then there's also VA benefits, right? And VA healthcare that you can enroll in. And
As
really,
long as you qualify.
as long as you qualify, right? And so you don't necessarily have to be retiring to qualify for VA healthcare either. And so that's really something to know about, but that has to do more with your rating. So obviously, whether you're doing your rating on the BDD side of the house or you're doing a fully developed claim after you've already gotten out, those are things to consider as you're looking at VA healthcare. But this is kind of a big moment to decide. And you have to make some decisions on this, right? You do have a 90-day window to make those decisions. And we did a deep dive into this with Lila Quintiliani on episode 5. So that was so at the beginning,
Yeah.
but that was because we did think it was so important, right? That was our one of our first pieces. And then you and I talk about it a little bit when we did another episode on salary and benefits negotiations. And we did talk a little bit about healthcare with your employer and thinking about that when you're, moving on to your next career.
Yeah.
And that was episode 37.
Yeah. And of course, when we talk about it in the context of salary and benefits negotiation, really, I mean, what we're speaking to are those who are going to be on a TRICARE plan or a VA plan or something like that. And you can use that as leverage to be able to kind of like move the needle a little bit on what your, going in base salary might be.
Right.
So things to think about, and use it as a way, as you're going to talk a little bit probably about dental and vision,
Mhm.
there are multiple parts to healthcare plans after you get out of uniform. So remember
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do have to have dental and vision, which is probably something when you were currently serving that maybe you didn't think about. Maybe your family had vision and dental or something else, but this is something that you need to make a decision on. The last thing I'll mention too, and this was actually something that I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday, but aging out of TRICARE when you're a young adult. So if your children are like college age, right, and they're moving into TRICARE young adult, that is very expensive because TRICARE actually ends, even if you're in school and enrolled full time, it ends at 23, where many, many healthcare plans actually end at 26, but TRICARE is a little different.
Yeah.
And so maybe you want to use your employer's healthcare plan if your child is going beyond 23 years of age and staying at a university or something like that.
Yeah.
So there are ways you can kind of use those together. So definitely important things to think
for
about.
contextual purposes, just so you understand how expensive the TRICARE young adult is. 1 month of our oldest daughter
of
was
Select.
of TRICARE Select as a young adult was almost as much as the entire annual premium for the rest of the three of us, Andia and I and our youngest. So that young adult
Yeah.
piece, once they age out and they're no longer in school, can be significantly costly. So again, evaluating that, employer piece or what makes the most sense for, that particular stage of life, is pretty important to kind of keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. I mean, right now in 2026, there's $373 a month for TRICARE Young Adult, and that's for TRICARE Select. And so Prime is more than twice that much. So it's
Yeah.
actually kind of crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Healthcare ain't cheap.
Yes, that's right. And that's why it can become a bargaining chip with your employer too, right? Which is why we talk about it in that
For sure.
respect. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay. What's next?
Okay, so next is another type of insurance, but life insurance in this respect, right? So as you leave the uniform service, right, you're going to get rid of SGLI. You may, depending on your circumstance, have the ability to apply for and retain VGLI, the Veterans Group Life Insurance. As a retiree, you've got the option to consider things like the Survivor Benefit Plan or SBP. Um, as you retire, that option is automatically vested at 6% unless you opt out.
Hmm.
And now, remember, if you happen to be married, your spouse, if you decide you want to opt out, your spouse must also sign and you both have to opt out of that. So there are some things with SBP on the surface.
And you can also have a lower amount. It
Yes.
doesn't have to be the full amount either. So there are a lot of options that
Yeah.
you can think about with
And I think it's
SBP.
in whole percent increments. So you
Mhm.
can go as low as 1%, you can do 2%, so forth, all the way up to the automatic maximum at 6%. But what that does is that 6% gives you that 55% of that retirement pension will be available to your spouse until, he or she may, pass on as well. And again, SBP, VGLI, all of these things are things that are not going to be right for everybody, but they may be very right for other folks. So definitely do the homework, understand what they are and what they aren't, and how that impacts what you all are going to do, post military service. But then third party coverage. So third party coverage is an interesting piece, not just for the member, but for spouses as well. So for me, for example, based off of my rating, I wanted to make sure that I had the ability to do third party insurance before I got my rating based on, yes, exactly. Because once you get your rating, all of that is you must disclose because you have medical ratings or ratings based off of conditions that may not be curable and may, further evolve over time and make you less insurable or insurable at a significantly higher cost. So evaluate that, and based off of the timing on when you evaluate it, again, and when you get into the private party and third party insurance providers, there's whole life, there is term, there are
Universal.
universal. Yes. Oh my gosh. So get with a no kidding professional and, understand what that means. But then you can also, much like what Andia talked about with the healthcare piece, whether you become a government civilian after the fact or, you're in the private sector, your employer may offer life insurance options or short-term and long-term disability insurance pieces too, which are, kind of, I think, a subset of the life insurance piece because it's
Yeah.
about livelihood, I guess, in that respect.
Yeah,
But
and the industry average for that is about twice your annual salary. So that's something to think of as well. But that's a great point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So again, think about all those things as you're talking to whatever that next employer is. And for reference, we would ask you to check out episode 3 with Heather Walrath, where she talks about survivor benefit plan. Episode 7 with Jerry Quinn, where he talks about life insurance planning. And then episode 37 again with us, where we talk about that in the sense of salary and benefits negotiation. Because again, if you've got all this stuff lined up and you don't want to automatically be opted into and pay for an employer plan, that can be something that instead of, the company, paying out of pocket for you, they can pay it and put it in your pocket.
Yeah. What a great episode we
I
did.
know, right? All right. So
But I do think, yeah, that one we did with Jerry really breaks down all those pieces of life
yeah.
insurance, right? Because there are so many. So that's a great episode. Yeah.
Yes,
To
absolutely.
reference.
And there are a lot of companies out there and, understanding like how to stack it and tier it based off of your circumstance. Again, there's so many different facets of this. It shouldn't just be a one and done. And, it's things that you're going to want to think about as you kind of go through the curvature of your life.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
bucket three.
All right, bucket three. This is taxes and residency.
Ooh, taxes.
We always say that, but there are some good things you can do and some ways that you can maybe avoid taxes or at least think about what your tax plan is. So one
Remember,
of the
avoidance, not evasion.
that's right. Avoidance, not evasion. I think Atia taught us that, right?
Yes.
So if you're thinking about residency, I think this is a big one, right? Like we've talked a lot about our state residency in Virginia and the reasons that we've stayed here and some of the, I mean, not just for jobs, but
Sure.
but also
Reasons.
there were reasons, but we also, we had new tax implications for the first time ever. We're paying state taxes, right? So we had a big tax bill our first year and that we luckily were planning for, and that was really good. But think about those residency things when you're moving. Think about the timing. Another big one is home ownership. So if you're getting ready to move during this time and you're trying to move, and I think this Grant really laid this out well in that episode, which was episode, let's see, it's on my list here, so many, 27. Yeah. So Grant really laid this out, this idea of moving and trying to buy a home at the exact same time that you're transitioning. There's a big timing piece there that I think people really need to pay attention to. Yeah. So not only are we talking, property tax, state taxes, employment taxes, and then whether your pension is taxed if you're retiring, things like that, and other, education benefits. So we have a lot of episodes I'm going to talk about really quick because I think they're all worth mentioning. So first was episode 14 we did with Brandon Levenger, where we did a deep dive into financial readiness overall. And that had a lot to do with the timing. And then Todd McCaffrey and the shuns, right? Location, compensation, vocation, yep. Which I still talk about to this day. I actually did yesterday in a class that I was teaching, but it was really something to be thinking about. Those are three big pieces, right? And part of that was we talked to him about state benefits. So he's out in South Carolina. And then of course Atia, episode 24, Grant of Vermeer, where we talked about the residency pieces and buying a home. That was episode 27. And then very last was super fun. And that was with Mike Mannion, where we talked about being an expat and what are the tax implications and even healthcare, right? TRICARE overseas. And there are great implications for that as well. I've said implications a lot today.
Episode 29 on that one.
Did I say that? No, I missed it.
That's okay.
Well,
that's
29.
We're here. We keep each other in check. Yeah.
All right.
So the last bucket that I think is really important to think about, or that we think is really important to think about as you get ready to take that uniform off and move on, are education benefits, not just for use, but for transfer, because timing on that matters, right? So the GI Bill in all forms, because we know there are many out there, they have rules on transferability and use, whether it's for yourself or for a dependent as applicable. Know what those rules are when you have to implement those milestones, the service commitments that you might incur in making those designations. But at the end of the day, really, it's about early planning and having a strategy in using those, right? For both you and your dependents, if that's what you choose to do with it. Because it's important to think about before all of a sudden it's time and you've got to work with the VA and do all of those things. One other interesting aspect of it too, we learned, right? For, let's say, depending on your level of disability, if you rate Chapter 35 benefits, Chapter 35 benefits cannot be paid out at the same time as the GI Bill benefit. So sequencing that stuff, again, having that strategy and understanding what benefits are available to you, when they can pay out, how they can pay out, to whom they can pay out, all of that matters. Also, do your research on the institution that you plan on trying to levy those benefits. Get in contact with those VA benefits counselors at the institution early to understand what is going to work for you or not in the particular situation that you're strategizing against. Get the strategery there.
Strategery. So one thing I just want to mention really quick, which we were just talking to a couple that mentioned this. So you were talking about transferability, and he actually thought that if he transferred it to his wife, that it was actually taken care of, and then he could move it, within his dependents. It's actually incorrect. So you need to transfer at least 1 month to every dependent.
Yes.
If you want them to have access process, and then you can move it around after that.
Correct.
So that's a really important part about transferability. I just wanted to point out, make sure people are thinking about that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also important, I might recommend, make sure you leave at least 1 month for yourself, because
Yes.
if you go down that pathway and nobody ends up using it because, they've got, massive academic capabilities, or they get, collegiate scholarships
Scholarships.
for
Yeah.
sports or
Yeah.
what have you, and everything is paid for, or they decide they don't want to go to college right away. Maybe they join the military and they get their own GI Bill benefit. Then what happens? Then, what if you want to go back to school? So again, make sure, as Andia mentioned, have at least 1 month designated for everybody in the family that might use it. Ultimately, it's your benefit as the service member, and you move it where you want to. But I would recommend making sure you've got maximum flexibility.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's the most important part,
absolutely.
right? That flexibility. Because of course, once you're done, you can move it around. Want
That's right.
right?
That's
Yeah.
right. I would submit it's probably not terribly easy to go back on active duty just to get the years
Yeah,
to
maybe
to
not.
move that after the fact. So, many of us have aged out at that point in time. So again, that prior planning will make sure.
Strategery.
Strategery. Yes. Have the strategery, folks. And if you want to go back and talk or review some of these episodes where we're looking at these things, we talked about state benefits, because from an education piece too, talking about what institutions are going to do things like yellow ribbon or what have you are important. So episode 15 with Todd McCaffrey on state resources is an important one. Episode 19 and 20, both with Dedrick Curtis and Kate Horrell, talking about GI Bill and the deep dive there. We had to split it into two because there's so many aspects of it. Episodes 22 and 25 with Ryan Pavel and Britt Andrade, specifically on higher education. And episode 31 with Sydney Mathis, when you talk about college acceptance, because acceptance in and of itself is a whole other ballgame where it deals with a lot of the benefits that you may be bringing to the table. So
Yeah, and
having all those,
the different nonprofits that are out there working in those spaces too, that I think we really wanted people to know about, and being able to leverage resources, because that's
absolutely.
what this is all about, really.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny that all four of these different buckets that we talked about all have to do with money.
Yeah, everything has to do with money, honey.
Absolutely. That was my point, right? They all have to do with money, because your livelihood after you take the uniform off, it doesn't get any cheaper, but you can, strategize on the front end of this strategy and ensure that your livelihood and your dollar will go as far as it possibly can to your benefit and your family's benefit by having this, kind of checklist on the front of your calculus as you decide to move on out of the military and into whatever your next tour is.
That's right. That's right. This is all about, making sure that you're set up for success. It can feel overwhelming at times. So we really wanted to break this down into those 4 buckets today and talk about that. And then, of course, give you the references to our past episodes, which we've tried to, break down into small bits. But overall, we really think those are the big 4 that you really need to focus on. And, if you've kind of got that lined up, it really is setting you and your family up for success as you, move on to your next tour.
Yeah. Now, obviously, the job stuff, the VA claim piece of it, yes, those are absolutely other bucket items. But in terms of the pre-planning aspect of it, this is definitely where we think it is. Now, in the show notes, we will absolutely link to all the episodes that we mentioned. So this will be a lengthy show note. But of course, once you click on the episode that interests you and you want to get that deep dive, those show notes will also have all the resources linked specifically for that episode as well. So a little bit of a rabbit hole or an exploratory kind of thing. So, choose your own adventure. Get out there and take a look and re-look at these episodes and re-listen to them and get those resources that you need. And hit us up with questions and, share this info with folks that you find that, need some help, that maybe need a little bit of guidance in getting the accuracy and what's legit out there. That's the whole purpose of why we're doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Ian said, if there's something you have a burning question you want us to do a deep dive in, we'd love to. So let us know. And we're excited for the rest of this year and this season. So keep joining us on the next tour.
Thanks, guys.
The views, opinions, and advice expressed by our guest on the next tour are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast, Ian, Andia, or any affiliated organizations. While we strive to provide helpful and accurate information, this podcast is for informational purposes only. We encourage listeners to consult with professionals or conduct their own research before making any significant decisions related to military transition or post-service life. The content is intended as guidance and personal perspective, not as official advice.